Hi, I'm Peter Hopkins, president and co-founder of BigThink.com, and it is my pleasure to welcome best-selling author Richard Florida for a live interview today. Richard is far and away one of the world's leading experts on business and business sociology, and today we're going to talk about his research into the creative class, which is the emergent group of people who are really driving economic growth, both in the US, North America, and around the world. Richard, great to have you.
Hey, it's great to be here, Peter.
Yeah. So let's start by framing for the audience, what is the creative class?
Well, as you said in your kind intro, it's sort of the driving force of innovation and economic growth. And before I came up with this idea, I mean, there was a lot of really smart people thinking about this change from an industrial society, you know, an old blue-collar, manufacturing-driven, steel and autos kind of economy, to a post-industrial economy. And people like Dan Bell, the great sociologist at Columbia and then at Harvard, wrote a lot about this. And then, of course, Peter Drucker, you know, probably the greatest management thinker of all time, kind of dubbed this group of people, him and a guy named Fritz Malchuk in the 50s, dubbed this group of people knowledge workers. And the idea was that people work with knowledge, they accumulate knowledge. Economists talked about developing education and human capital. And I was living in Pittsburgh at the time, teaching at Carnegie Mellon, and I was looking at, just like you and others, developments in the internet and technology. And I noted this kind of thing with content and software. And then I began to see the role of arts and music. And I remember going to England one time, and this guy asked me a question about software development and biotech clusters. I looked at him, I said, who are the richest people in England? Well, he's like, that's Paul McCartney and Mick Jagger. So I said, there's something with arts and music and entertainment and something with technology, something with knowledge workers. What do they all have in common? And one day, I was reading some psychology, and they were talking about human creativity. This guy, Rob Sternberg, wrote, if you're an entrepreneur or a business leader, an artist or a musician, a designer, something like that, you're a creative person. I said, oh my God. Maybe it's not just a knowledge class or a post-industrial class. Maybe the thing that links these people together, like the blue-collar worker used physical labor in the factory, maybe the thing that links these people together is their creativity. So we went back and we counted them with a great group of researchers at Carnegie Mellon. And we first counted them across cities. And then we said, we're going to go back 100 years and count this group of people. And what we saw is that over the past 100 years, but certainly since 1980, this group was really expanding. And just to give folks the numbers, between 1980 and today, even with the crisis, we added 20 million new jobs in the creative sector of the economy. That's science, technology, arts, entertainment, filmmaking, design, and then the knowledge workers, right? Healthcare practitioners, lawyers, those financial people who caused part of this problem. And in the United States, that's about a third of the workforce, more or less. And this creative class, even though they make up a third of the workforce, if you add up all the wages and salaries we pay in the United States, and you divide it into three groups, right? The manufacturing working class, the people who do services, lower end services, you know, wait on you in restaurants, sell you your clothes, take care of your house. And then the creative class. The creative class already accounts for more than 50%. And the other thing, just for folks watching, we've actually tracked the unemployment situation, and it's quite devastating in some respect. While the overall US unemployment rate is 10%, and while manufacturing workers have unemployment rates of 15%, and in some parts, like extraction and construction, 25%, the creative class is about 5%. So the creative class has never seen great swings. I mean, that's up from 2% before, but it's never seen these great volatility and swings that really devastate manufacturing. And so I think as we come out of this crisis, we're going to again see that this group is more stable, this group of jobs is more stable, and they're going to grow again.
So let's key off that. You have an idea that you've called the creative economic revolution. And that really ties in to this notion of this class that is helping to drive prosperity. What is actually happening to the economy as you see it that is enabling the rise of this class of people?
Well, I actually think behind the crisis is kind of the inflection point or the transformation point. You know, if you look back at the two previous crises, and I'm actually writing a book on this, it's called The Great Reset. Hopefully you'll invite me back to talk about it when it comes out in April or May. But if you look back on previous crises, they've always been associated with the rise of new economic systems. So the crisis of 1873 was associated with the rise of, the first industrial revolution, and it gave rise to the second. The crisis of the 1930s was the rise of the second industrial revolution and these big steel companies and auto companies. And then we figured out how to make the society work. This is really a crisis, not just the financial markets and wanted spending and too much credit. It's a tectonic crisis that's associated with the rise of a new economic order. And what we were doing is because we didn't know how to invest in it, we were speculating like wild and money was flowing into real estate. So the creative economic revolution has really been going on in my view, since the 60s. And it's funny, because I went back and looked at this, and folks might not know this, but what I really wanted to be in life was a guitar player. So all my childhood, I spent playing guitar and trying to sound like Jimi Hendrix or Jeff Beck, with some degree of non-success. But in the 60s, we saw all of this creative revolution, and even before that, jazz in the 50s, but the beat revolution, and then the 60s thing happening in New York. And I just read the fabulous book on Warhol and the Velvet Underground. Mm-hmm. So, you can see this stuff building up as people are tired of and kind of blanching at the strictures of the old organization man society. And it's kind of, it's kind of why we're all fascinated by Mad Men, I think. You see this transformation, this kind of pivot point, right, running through as Mad Men develops. And this creative thing emerging, but people don't know what to do. And so the one way I kind of view the 1960s is this giant temper tantrum, right? Creative people just saying, I'm not going to take it anymore, Mom and Dad. I want to grow my hair long. I want to grow a beard. I want to go to California. I want to listen to new kind of music. This explosion in art. But it wasn't really hinged to the economy. In the book, I said Woodstock wasn't the signal event of the creative revolution. Silicon Valley is. And so I think what happened almost at the same time is these people who were tired of working in the big companies, innovators, some people working at IBM and General Electric, Bell Labs, said, no, we have all this cool stuff we want to make, all this interesting stuff we want to make. The company's very bureaucratic. It's not paying attention to us. Somehow they found their way out to the San Francisco Bay Area and began to build these enterprises that they owned and controlled, right? They began to devise new structures and new forms. And actually, Peter, my entire early research career, well before I came to any ideas of the creative class, was trying to figure out what Silicon Valley was. I wrote a book in 1990 about this called The Breakthrough Illusion. In any event, I think those structures began to take hold, and this new group of people who had the ideas began to be seen as more economically valuable. And what's happened over the past 20 or 30 years, as manufacturing has been offshored and outsourced and moved to the BRICS, but particularly China, I think in the advanced countries like the United States or Canada or Scandinavia or Northern Europe, this creative input, this idea input, this mental labor has become more important. So I see this shift as big as and fundamental as the shift, that Marx wrote about when we move from a feudal or agricultural society to a modern industrial economy and society. I see this shift kind of the same way. We're moving from an older industrial society where value was created by physical labor and raw materials to a new kind of society and economy where value raw materials and physical labor and agriculture are still important. We need to eat and drive things, and we need homes. But this mental value added, this creative labor is becoming more important. So that's why I think this is a big revolution on the order of the transformation from an agrarian society to an industrial economy and society.
And I do a lot of interviews, and I think that this actually is one of the most powerful forces at work today, and particularly from the perspective of the displaced manufacturing worker, somebody working on an assembly line. They're looking at a huge divide between the world that gave them prosperity and this new world. I guess the question is, if you are one of those people, what is your future? Is creativity and these new pursuits something that they can ultimately learn and buy into, or what becomes of them in this new world that you described?
Well, if you're one of those folks, it's terrifying. I lived in Pittsburgh for nearly 20 years. If you're a person who had a great job in a steel mill and then you get displaced when you're 35 or 40 or 50, my wife Rana, who's here, just in the other room, folks, she's from Greater Detroit. And we'll go back, we went back there for Thanksgiving, we'll go back there for the Christmas holiday. I mean, the devastation that's happened to people who grew up thinking they had fabulous, stable jobs with the big three is truly horrific. But I think as a society, we've got to understand this shift. 100 years ago, if we were sitting here, we wouldn't be in a television studio, but if we were sitting around talking, we would have been terrified that agricultural jobs were going away. And if you were faced with the prospect of losing your farm or being forced off the farm and having to move to one of these growing industrial cities, people were terrified. And the debate was, well, where are these people going to work? If there's no jobs on the farm anymore and these automated factories are so productive. But we invented, and I guess I'm an optimist in this sense, throughout human history we've always invented new ways of working, new divisions of labor. So my hope is that we can do it again. What I worry about, though, when I really worry about, like thinking about the Obama Job Summit and the conversation about employment, most of that conversation is either about government-created employment, which is a good stopgap. It can work for a while. The WPA and all of that in the Depression created jobs for a while. Or it's about how do we protect these manufacturing jobs, which are good jobs. My dad worked in a factory all of his life. And I talk about him in my books, and maybe people watching have that. But my dad got a job at 13. He actually had to leave school in the 7th grade in Newark because he had to go to work. His brothers and sisters had to go to work. My grandpa had to work. And my grandma worked in a bakery. It took 9 people to make a family wage. And my dad worked in an eyeglass factory in the down next section of Newark, the ironbound section. It was called Victory Optical, this giant brick building. And I remember my dad telling me when I was a little boy, he said, Rich, when I started working in that factory in 1934 and 1935, I had a really crappy job. I mean, I made low wage. I had virtually no benefits. We worked long shifts. And remember, people used to bemoan manufacturing work as terrible, dirty, dangerous. William Blake called factories satanic mills. My dad said, but when I came back, he enlisted in World War II, and he was an infantry soldier in the great battles, D-Day and all of that, storming the beaches. When I came back from World War II, he said, Rich, something happened to my job. It became a good job. Now, obviously, there was unions that helped to do this, and collective bargaining, and government, the Wagner Act that Franklin Roosevelt passed, and occupational health and safety. But my dad said, my bad job became a good job. And so what we've been working on actually in our institute, and so glad you can come up to Toronto where we live now, what the city of Toronto has been pioneering, and I think we're going to help define this turf. We mentioned that 1/3 of the jobs are in the creative class. About 20% of jobs are in blue collar. 45% of jobs, 45% of all jobs are the service jobs. What we talk, the retail jobs, the shop jobs, the restaurant jobs, the manicurists, the haircutters, the makeup people. Those jobs pay the least. They have the most tenuous circumstance. So one of the things we're trying to do right here in Toronto and with the city and city workers and city government and folks here, but also I think needs to be talked about more, is how do we make that group of service jobs, good, high-paying jobs, equivalent to the fact, lower skill, like the factory job was, but how do we make those jobs more innovative? How do we get people involved like they were in the factories and improving productivity? And how do we raise pay? That's one of the key things we're working on. And that's the kind of job somebody who worked in an auto plant, if it was high paying and it was a good job, not if it's a $10 an hour job, but if it was a good job with a career progression, that's the kind of job they could naturally slip over to.
So let's focus on that for a minute. It's a very interesting concept, elevating the restaurant worker, the hairstylist, to a higher plane in society. That would seem to have to involve some greater investment of value. You can't just wave a magic wand and make the McDonald's worker, a high-level part of the economy. What can be done to make them more value additive and produce more relative to their inputs?
Well, it means one thing, that we're going to have to pay more for our burgers. And at the end of the day, it's worth it. We spend a lot of money for a car. We spend a lot of money even for a television set or a computer. Now, they've come down in price. We spend a lot of money for the clothes we wear. And then, we don't want to spend a lot of money for the food we put into our body. Or what about the person who takes care of your ailing parent or your kid? I mean, to me, we're going to have to pay more for that. So as a society, we're going to have to pay more. Okay, people might not like that, but if we want to elevate jobs and create livelihoods for people. The other thing that we see happening, and we're trying to organize this, some of these companies to come, and boy, oh boy, I wish Obama would do this. This would be the job summit. I actually looked, because I'm a geek, I looked at the Best Places to Work Institute, their research on the best places to work in the US economy. And folks can go to it. They'll see that I have the wrong names. But, you get all kinds of interesting tech companies on that list. The SAS Institute, which I actually did a case study in North Carolina. Genentech. All of these cool names that Apple. The other companies, and some consulting firms, right? The other companies on that list are like Zappos, Wegmans, Whole Foods, Container Store. What those companies are doing is actually they're viewing their workers as a source of creativity, innovation. And they're taking a page from a company like Toyota, which said, we're going to view our workers not so much as a liability, we're going to organize them in teams, we're going to tap into their brain power. And the guy who really challenged me on this, when he was CEO of Best Buy, was Brad Anderson. Remember, he came and we had this roundtable discussion in Washington, D.C. at the Gallup organization. And Brad was saying, in my Best Buy store, there's not much I can do to improve performance. I mean, we sell the same TVs, we sell the same stereo sets, we sell the same appliances, and we have a kind of standard process. He said, the only way I could really make my stores better is by getting the intelligence of my employees. So he started to actually do what Toyota does. challenge the workers to actually come up with suggestions and continuous improvement, and and it would be simple. They would like figure out a way to move a display to get more sales. I remember one which just blew me away. They were trying to figure out why they weren't selling in ethnic neighborhoods in LA, and the one kid on the floor said, well, you're not having ads in not only Spanish but Vietnamese, so they started to write the ads. Now it's simple stuff like that, but that increases value. And what we've been unpacking in our work is the skill sets that really increased value in the workplace. And there are three kinds of skills in the workplace, really. There's physical skills. We actually pay a lot for physical skill in the United States or Canada, and it doesn't generate that much return. There are two other kinds of skills that really matter in the workplace. One is the obvious one in a knowledge economy, cognitive skill. So the more brain power of the team and you engage, the better. But the other one that actually pays more is what we call social skills. And by social skills, I don't mean just being friendly and extroverted and a good bartender. It's actually, and you'll know this in the stuff you discuss on this program, it's the ability to build teams, to motivate people, to get other people to be part of your cause or your mission. So I think if we could start to upgrade services with more cognitive skill, but not just more cognitive skill, more of this social skill. And I actually think from a business point of view, this is the great low-hanging fruit. The creative economy is humming along. Our factories are optimized. Now we can do better and more robots. But the low-hanging fruit in our economy is really bringing the services, the low-end services, into the 21st century. And so that's what I'd like to see happen. And I think in terms of job creation, it's millions upon millions of Americans work in that sector. It's highly insecure, it's low paying. It's the sector, if we want to say we're going to build the backbone again of a lot of jobs, it's the only place we have to look. Unless we just say, we're going to have a crappy, split, unequal economy, and I'm not willing to relent to that right yet.
Now, I'm curious, are there models, you mentioned Best Buy, but are there models that have been developed that actually are able to assign value to the work of service workers and actually cut them into some of the overarching value that they can generate through these things? Or is it simply, right now, just kind of casual and haphazard?
It's very casual and haphazard. We've been looking at the Four Seasons. It was started here in Toronto. It's, obviously a luxury brand. But it's the kind of brand that depends on allegiance of its customer, and it really has worked hard to, and the other thing is promotion from within. That's a key thing. You might start as a low-level person, but the ones that work always, just like Toyota, it's promotion from within. So you may start at the lowest occupation, but you can work your way up. I think now we're in the same situation as kind of Frederick Taylor, sitting there in the 1880s and 90s. And a few manufacturing companies were experimenting with time and motion studies and scientific management. We're certainly not where Henry Ford was when Henry Ford said we can add the assembly line and have an organized production system. So we're very early into this. And I think the key right now, and what we're trying to do at our institute, is really array a set of best practices. And we had a meeting last week and we said, we've got to go at this just the way people studied high performance or quality manufacturing. We've got to figure out what those best practices are in the workforce with regard to pay and benefits. And then we have to see to what degree they're diffusing and how they work together. But I think we're extremely early on. The companies I would look at, again, Whole Foods engaging its workers. To a certain degree, Starbucks, which is a pretty big company. Container Store is another one that's done a lot of this. And we're going to have to figure out models, Zappos online, figure out models that go beyond that and push it. I don't think it's an academics, who's going to lead this. I think this is a very much an inaction strategy project. Where, and maybe the better example is agricultural extension, right? How they began in the farm to move new technology onto the farm. And then what we used to call manufacturing extension back in the 80s, when they saw, oh my God, manufacturing is becoming leaner and more quality. As we identify those practices in an effort to diffuse them and to make people understand, you don't have to treat workers, you shouldn't ethically treat workers like crap, but in your grocery store, or in your mom and pop shop, or in your hotel operation, if you stop treating workers like a cost or a liability, you start treating workers as an asset, you invest in them, you upgrade their capabilities, you can get more productivity and innovation. That's where I think we have to go.
Now, is there something fanciful about this notion in that at the very moment where you're seeing a contraction in the consumer economy that we are now potentially relying on consumption and treating workers better and paying them more as a ballast for the rest of the economy?
Well, isn't this the great problem in every crisis? Isn't this what Keynes wrote about? The nature of a crisis is a big race to the bottom, right? That's what a crisis is about. Everybody says, oh my God, I've got to cut costs. I've got to get my balance sheet in order. And so Keynes and others in the United States, businessmen, were worried about, oh my God, how are we going to create demand, this ephemeral thing called demand? And what they quickly figured out is the only way you're going to create demand is by raising the incomes of workers. If you kept the workers' incomes low and you paid them like crap and you gave them minimum wage or below subsistence wage in the factory, how do you create that demand that we're going to buy the cars and the houses with? So they put a lot of effort into that. And actually, I mean, in the United States, not only the Keynesian thing, but the United States moved pretty close. We actually had a full employment bill in the House and the Senate in the late 1940s. And then, fortunately, the machine kicked into action. That got tabled. Now, in other countries, in Scandinavia, in Northern Europe, and Japan, that became a reality. But here it got scuttled. The United States got scuttled. And the idea was that we can create demand. And one of the things we create that demand by building roads, by building houses, by building appliances. It became a cycle. When I was a younger person, we used to talk about Fordism, a fancy concept for not only Fordist mass production, right? What the theorists at the time were arguing, not only do you have this mass production system with assembly lines and steel mills and car factories pumping this stuff out, you had to build not only a Fordist economy, you had to build a Fordist society. Well, the Fordist society required higher wages. Henry Ford's great idea that, oh my God, these workers need to make $5 a day so they can buy a car. And you needed to have institutions, right? Governmental institutions, a social welfare state, infrastructure investment, mortgage banking that could make it affordable to buy a house. We don't even have that conversation now. All we're thinking about is how do we cut the cost, how do we get the economy back on track, and then the silliness of like trying to reflate the old Fordist thing. I mean, I like slam my head against my desk. You know, we're going to do a cash for clunker. We're going to do a cash for appliances. We're going to have everybody redo their mortgage so they can buy another house they can't afford, or walk away from this house and buy another house. One of the things that we're going to have to figure out is how to, and this is a big task. This is a task like we faced in the 19th century. What kind of society do we have to build if we're going to uncork this tremendous creative and productive potential? This is not just a task of, Keynesian demand management and fixing the economy and making sure the bubble doesn't blow up. This is a task of building a whole new social order. And what I like that we're having this conversation, but what I'm scared about is in the halls of power, in the corridors of power, as far as I can see around the world, this conversation isn't going on. And that conversation did go on in the United States and in England and in other places in the 1880s. It did go on in the 1930s and 40s. And maybe it's because we're so early. This thing just happened a year ago. Maybe it's because it's so early and we think we can just brush it aside. But sooner or later, I hope that conversation emerges. How do we build a society which values the creativity of everyone, creates markets for that creativity, creates good jobs for people, and is functional?
I mean, it's striking how eerily silent it is across so many domains where this should be front of mind. One area is education. This is not a conversation, at least to my knowledge, and we interview a lot of education thought leaders, where this is taking place in terms of the curricula, in terms of how students are taught to think about their role in the larger macroeconomy. My question for you is, for viewers out there who are listening to this and wondering, where do I fit in? What would be your counsel with regard to how they self-prepare, how they train themselves outside of a system that is perhaps not ready to do it for them? What are the skills that they need to develop, whether to be a value-additive service worker on the one end, or a hyper intellectual or knowledge-driven creative worker? Well,
the interesting thing about service work, now that you say it, is a lot of the creative class is moving into this work. And I think that's why you see such a revolution. And I mean, this fellow Matt Crawford, who sometimes criticizes me, I have no beef with the guy, who says he left his PhD and went back to open his motorcycle shop. Well, he had the skills and the capability to make a great motorcycle shop. You see so many members of the creative class going into, home repair or food. The whole revolution that's going on in food and restaurants and organic products. In Canada, where we live, this whole thing with ice wine and upgrading of ice wine. So you see the members of the creative class going into this stuff and saying, oh, that's really interesting. In terms of skills, I think our work has helped us identify this. I think in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, we've all been, and in Asia, we've all been told, be smart. That's what my parents said. My dad said, I work in the factory, Rich, and they sent me to Catholic school, Queen of Peace, of all places, boys' high school in North Arlington, New Jersey, in the heart of Sopranos country. And why did they send us there? Two boys, Richard and Robert. They wanted us to have a good education. That was the ticket to upward mobility. And you got a career. So we went to Rutgers College, got Garden State scholarships, and figured out, I majored in urban planning and figured out it was the way into the economy. I think now, though, that's not enough. Of course, an education is helpful. And our work suggests that the cognitive skills, the knowledge skills are only part of it. Actually, it's the social skills that really matter. And if I had to be really blunt and give kind of business advice, the one thing that we don't teach, I teach in a business school, the one thing that we don't teach in a business school, that we don't teach in school is not only entrepreneurship, we don't teach people how to sell. It's been the hardest thing I've ever had to learn. How do you sell? How do you pitch a book project? How do you, and you know this too, you had to build a company. We have kids, and I try to hire people, and they say, I'll come work for you, but I don't want to sell. Well, I mean, I hate to say it, in this kind of economy that we have, this fragmented, what Dan Pink calls a free agent economy, which I think can be better for lots of people if we have the right social supports and right benefit systems. We have to sell more. So the social skills, the team building, the selling. The other part was education, and we talk more about this, but I always hated school from day one. I never liked it. I never felt it was an education system. I felt it was an education school. Maybe it's because I went with nuns, and I have the scars to prove it.
They have that effect.
Yeah, but I never liked it. In college, I never went to class. And you know, what's interesting about this, you know, and I hung out with my friends and we talked about interesting stuff, and we had this, you know, kind of wide-ranging seminar over beers at night. But you know, whether it's Steve Jobs or Michael Dell or Bill Gates, people who are far more business savvy than I'll ever be, or most of us, 99.9% of us, all of them dropped out of school. So that's telling me that something in the system is broken. And I think one of the great things about technology, and I don't want to overblow technology, but we both love it, I think that technology enables kids to learn without having to be stuck in these many stultifying places called schools. And if we look at learning less as real estate, as, you know, send the kid to a school, and more as development. I mean, Ken Robinson nails this, you know, when he talks about it. Like 99% of 3-year-olds score as creative. They go to school for a few years, it's down to 50. By the time they're teenagers, it's 10, and by the time they're my age, it's like 1%. I forget his statistics, but there's something like that. So I think we have to build institutions not of education, but of learning, and those are going to have to be human-centered and individual, and I think the technology gives us a chance. But you know, when Bill Gates said the school system is broken, he's right. When Peter Drucker said, the research university will not survive the transition to knowledge-based capitalism, the way we deliver learning is very broken and very unhuman. So it seems to me that's got to be a first principle. We've got to somehow, you know, it's really interesting. In the 1800s, we built a system of mass public education, 1850s and 60s. In the 1890s, we started to really work on the colleges and the universities and build them up. After the war, we had the GI Bill, and we made education available to working class people like me. My dad went to 7th, my grandfather had none, my dad 7th grade, I have a university education. I think what we have to do now to remake this system is bigger than all of that combined. And here we think about tweaking the schools at the margin. If we're really going to build this kind of creative society, we have to completely reinvent the way human beings develop and learn.
You raise a really epic point, and you know, we've seen this across so many areas. The challenge of actually remaking institutions, which is actually a different project than building them in the first place, because you've got to uproot a lot of existing and entrenched interests and reteach a lot of ingrained practices. Where do you see us in that process, particularly with respect to education and how it cultivates creativity? Has it begun? Is there any model, or are we literally at, you know, the starting point?
It's funny, if you look beneath all of my writing, and I often say I'm a much better verbal, I try to write, but I'm not a great writer, and it's hard for me, and I'm an academic, so that makes it worse. I'm an okay talker. So all of my work really is about this question of institutional redesign. I mean, from the beginning of my work in the late 1980s and 1990s was always about institutional design. And I think our institutions, the mass production institutions, the Fordist institutions, have been broken now for a generation. And yet nobody wants to confront it. And I don't understand why. You know, Mansur Olson wrote, the real key to the decline of nations was when these institutions become, he called it sclerotic. Institutional sclerosis. He said, why regions decline, why nations decline, why companies decline is very simple. These institutions are built. They're great for the time they're built. They work like clockwork. And then over time, as the environment changes, or they just become more rigid and bureaucratic and sclerotic. And he said that's sometimes why history moves from the Netherlands to England to the United States, you know, from the East Coast to the West Coast, and now some say, I think it's early in this, to Asia, the Asian century. But I think the bigger question, and I think what the United States has been uncanny at, you know, my dad used to say this. He said, Rich, you know, when I signed up for the Army, remember the Depression, how down we were. And then when I signed up for the Army, we had doughboy hats and these old boots, and they gave us broomsticks. He said the mobilization, he didn't say institutional resign, the mobilization for the war and the factories got changed and the government got into it. And boy, we turned on a dime. I am puzzled as an American living in Canada why we can't do this anymore. Why we're so locked in is the word I think economists would use. And I don't know what it's going to take to blow that up. But the interesting thing is it's not happening anywhere in the world. It's not like you can look at China and say they're redesigning their institutions, or Brazil and say they're redesigning their institutions. It's almost as if everyone is stuck in the same place. It seems to me that the mental models and frameworks of the Fordist economy, of the mass production economy, are so powerful and so deeply ingrained in the way we think, it's hard to think in other terms. And so what I think happened, actually, is people create their own safe space. So the folks in Silicon Valley said, screw that. I'm not going to go try to rebuild industrial Fordism. I'm going to carve out a really cool thing here in Silicon Valley for me. You know, I'm not going to take this on and redo arts education. I'm going to build a little interesting arts district in my community. So I think there's enough space and flexibility in the system that people could find their niche, so to speak. But I think the bigger question is one of institutional redesign. And for folks, you know, listening in, the clock of history is always ticking. It doesn't stop. So it's not like history stops, we've reached the end of history and the last man. The clock of history ticks. Sooner or later, some group of people somewhere, someplace will figure this out. And as they figure it out and get this institutional redesign right, they'll get, well, huge advantage, huge competitive advantage, huge first mover advantage, and they'll eclipse us. Now, I still think we have a little time, because these are generational processes, but somebody's got to wake up. And hopefully it'll happen soon. Hopefully that's what this event we're going through, this economic shock we're going through, hopefully it'll allow people to wake up and say, these are the new kinds of institutions. First, we have to take down the old ones that don't work anymore. That's a big job. And secondly, here are the new kinds of institutions we have to build to make a prosperous, a more creative, more productive, better society.
Now, you raised an interesting comparison. You talked about China. Really, we're entering an era where the cross-national comparison is going to be ever more apt, and we're going to be looking at best practices across the world. You said you really don't see any emergence of these approaches outside of the U.S. Will it be, you know, where do you expect it to come from, if not from beyond?
That's a great question. I think there's one place to look, and it's not because I'm interested in them. I think in this global world, what we've minimized, in this idea that the world is becoming global, we're all becoming the same, that the world is flat, we've minimized the role of cities. And this is why I've been spending a lot of my time working on cities, not just because I love cities, but because I think they're important. I actually think they're the key institutional actors. You know, in Rise of the Creative Class, I said a couple things. I said, one, that place is coming to replace the company as the key social and organizing unit of the creative economy. It's place that brings together people, it's place that collects people, talented people, ambitious people, whatever, entrepreneurial people. It's place that attaches us to work in a mobile society. And I said also that the key struggles of our time would no longer be factory struggles. They would literally be struggles about how our cities are used, who's moved around, gentrification. All of those things are coming true. But what I think is really interesting is that if you look at mayors around the world, you know, and the question I always ask is, why would somebody, like in your hometown, somebody like Mike Bloomberg, do you remember the mayors, the people who used to be mayor of New York, right? For Newark, where I grew up, Cory Booker's the mayor of Newark. Now, these were like completely dysfunctional people who were mayors. So you've got a whole new group of people who are more business sophisticated. And in some ways, let's not even take the United States. Who do you think is more powerful? The Prime Minister of England or the mayor of London? I'm making a broad statement. They may be both very powerful people. In China, who's really powerful? The guy who runs China or the mayor of Shanghai? So the mayors have their hands on this really interesting, very powerful economic unit. And I think at the city level, we're beginning to see people ask these kinds of deep questions. What I worry about is there's almost a disconnect. And the other thing that's so fascinating, I can tell you, you could tell me, anyone out there could say the difference between a Democrat and a Republican, a liberal and a conservative in a Congress or in a parliament at the national level. They're like ideologically distinct people. I go to visit a city, I meet a mayor, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative. If I don't know, I can't tell. You know, what is Bloomberg? What is Cory Booker? What is, you know, my friend John Hickenlooper in Denver? I don't know. I mean, I guess I could go find out, but they all seem very, Adrian Fenny in Washington, D.C., they're all very similar. And it's not ideologically driven. It's about making the city work pragmatically. So I think the real place to look for these best practices is at the city level. And you know, the cities are probably the places doing the most for the environment. And we know that they're environmentally, dense cities are environmentally better anyway. They're making, because they have to, big advances in education and retooling their school systems. They're the right place to do productivity policy or economic policy, not at the federal level, because they're closer to the action. So I think the place to look is at the city level. And I think maybe as much as we need a G2, right, to China and the US, and we need a G8 and we need a G20, maybe what we really need is to get some of these mayors involved in the dialogue and begin to learn, not from everything they've done, but some of the best examples. And I think the federal governments, the national governments would be well served by saying, look, we've got companies out there we can tap. We've got workers and union organizations we can tap for information. But these mayors and these cities are actually developing, in a very small way, in a local way, programs and approaches that we should take a look at.
Now, you mentioned a range of really kind of standout mayors, my mayor, Mike Bloomberg, being one of them. I mean, he's had a range of very interesting programs, one of which was relevant to us in that right after the economic crisis hit New York, devastating Wall Street, he announced a range of initiatives to incent entrepreneurs.
Absolutely.
And so I'm curious, are there examples that already would qualify as you would describe it as best practices that you've seen that you can point to specifically?
Well, our friends in the States, I'd come look at Toronto. I mean, where we're hanging, that's why I'm so glad you could come up here. I mean, I think in Toronto, the whole effort, one, to stem entrepreneurship, two, to really invest in the creative economy. And that is creating a backlash here. We're getting artists and musicians saying, hold on. I'm not a commodity. I'm an artist. I don't know if I want to. And this dialogue that's happening in this city, where we begin to see real estate price appreciation, because we have it here again. And people saying, no, wait, we have to go slow. Trying to figure out this balance between entrepreneurial action, the nature of the development in the city, the engagement of creative industries and creative people, and find a balance. We're really concerned in Toronto about mounting inequality. Now, we don't have inequality like we have in the United States, but my God, we're beginning to see economic segmentation. People are very concerned about this. The thing about Toronto that really blows my mind, we have another mayor's race. Our current mayor is a terrific mayor, and he's a spectacular guy and cares about this and understands it. We have 2 or 3 candidates already with their hats in the ring, all of whom would be spectacular mayors. I mean, it's like there's 3 or 4 people running for mayor, all who are equally smart and engaged. But I think focusing on entrepreneurship is one. Focusing on, of course, on technology, and that's been a big theme. You know, Mike Porter and cluster building. That's been a big theme of urban economic development now for a generation. I think this idea of getting creative people engaged, that we started to kick off, my team and I, getting creative people engaged, getting them motivated, getting them involved in the economy, dealing with urban inequality, dealing with the environment, making a city that's creative, sustainable, inclusive, and just. I mean, that is not just a city that's rich. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is figure out other measures of economic activity that are not just material goods. So, you know, everybody out there has heard about happiness. We've actually been measuring the happiness not just of nations, but of cities and states. Cities and states that have a bigger creative economy, the people are happier. The role of diversity. I think this is a key one. I've talked about this till I'm blue in the face. You can't have a great city unless you're open to diversity and everyone can contribute. We find that. The other thing that we've been looking at, which is just a mind blower, I started to get interested in health. And I think part of it is I saw people, my parents were lifelong smokers. My dad died of lung cancer. I hate those things. I'm sorry. I saw people stop smoking. I've never been a smoker. And I saw all these people starting to lose weight, right? It became a big thing. They're going to lose weight. They're going to get in shape. So I advanced this little hypothesis. What if the shift to smoking and away from obesity, what if this was something that was being caused by the post-industrial economy itself? Not just rising incomes. What if we could try to determine that healthier behavior, whether it's higher levels of satisfaction in your life and with everything, but moreover, no more smoking and no more eating, you know, massive quantities of fast food. We've just been doing this research, but the results are so mind-blowing. In places that have more of this creative economy, that have nurtured it and built it, that it's more robust, have higher educated populations, more involvement in the creative industries, significantly lower rates of obesity, significantly lower rates of smoking, controlling for income and economics. So I think something is happening in the places that do this that go quite beyond, and the mayors are we're beginning to get a handle. I mean, you might say no smoking policy or the labeling of food. All of these little things, you know, a good buddy of mine came back from England. He's a great economic developer. He actually runs the big economic development organization for North America. It's actually the world, but it's mainly US and Canada. And he said, you know, in our field, economic development and city development, you used to have a big fisher or a big game hunter go out and get that big auto plant or that big convention center and bring that big ball team to town. He said, if you want to do that, go to China. I mean, it was the most remarkable thing. He said, all the big projects, the big plants, the big steel mills, they're all going to be in China. If you want to do that, go to China. He said, what's so interesting about managing a city now is it's a bunch of little things that we typically haven't thought about. Making your creative industries better, making sure your artists and musicians have support, making sure the place is beautiful and physically interesting to people, investing in parks and green space, making sure that entrepreneurs, right, like Bloomberg's doing, have the supports they need and the space, the affordable space. Jane Jacobs said new ideas require old buildings. All of these millions and zillions of little things that are very locally rooted, that upgrade the capability of people. And that's a mind shift that's beginning to happen in some cities.
Now, one of the things that, on this point that you've said that I found very profound and very unique in its perspective is on the issue of gays and gay rights. You have said that this is perhaps one of the most telling indicators of a city's potential for economic prosperity. Explain that idea, and if you will, would you go so far as to say that there is actually an economic dimension to a lot of the social discussions, particularly taking place in the U.S. right now?
Well, at the highest level, I actually think that when we look back on the history of understanding economic growth, we're going to recognize, of course, Robert Solow won a Nobel Prize for this idea that technology matters to economic growth. We're surely going to understand, and we're understanding now, that human capital, knowledge accumulation matters. Whether it's Ed Glazier or Paul Romer at Stanford, that human capital accumulation, knowledge accumulation, Robert Lucas at Chicago. I think what we're going to finally understand is that these things that we thought as social and cultural characteristics, particularly with regard to openness to diversity, meritocracy, I call them the 3 T's, technology, talent, and tolerance. This tolerance dimension, this social and cultural dimension, is not just something we do because it's right and it's ethical and it's moral and it's the right way to treat people. We're going to find that these social and cultural factors really add a lot to economic growth. And it's not just the Protestant ethic of thrift and hard work that Max Weber identified a century ago. It's actually, I think, what made America great, in the great American century, was this idea that people could come from all over the world and make a life they want, have a dream that they wanted, do the kind of work, and without regard to ethnicity. So one of the things that we found, of course, when we look at the history of American entrepreneurship, there are lots of foreign-born people. Whether it's Andrew Carnegie in steel, or Andy Grove, the great semiconductor inventor at Intel, or anyone in the high tech. You know, Vivek Wadhwa and Annalise Saxenian did this great study where they looked at Silicon Valley and found that between 1/3 and 50% of all those companies were founded by somebody who wasn't born in the United States. Well, the thing with gays was really interesting to me. I was working on this at Carnegie Mellon, just minding my little old business, trying to study the knowledge economy and how cities compete and the role of quality of place factors and artists. And there was a young man who was completing his PhD. His name's Gary Gates. He's now at the Williams Institute at UCLA. And my dean at the time kept saying, you should meet Gary Gates. I was coming back from sabbatical at Harvard. You should meet Gary Gates. He's a great guy. He's been studying the location patterns of gay men and why they're clustered in San Francisco. What he's finding is that gay men in San Francisco have effect, or they're related to amenities, quality of life, a nice place, and so on and so forth. You're seeing the same thing with your high-tech people. So I went to meet Gary one day, and as I've learned, if you work in this kind of socially, I don't know, hot-button area, cultural hot-button area, there's a lot of debate and dialogue. You have to develop a sense of humor. So Gary said, Rich, let me see your list of your high-tech meccas. And of course, it was the San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley. It was Austin, Texas. It was Boston. It was Seattle. It was San Diego, and on and on. He's like, you've just named 5 of the 10 gayest places in America. So we laughed hysterically. And in my old New Jersey language, wouldn't it be a great goof, was the kind of way we ended it. Wouldn't it be a great goof to look at this? It was a joke. Well, shit, sorry. Excuse my French. We took a look at the data. And Gary is a fabulous statistician and demographer. And the more we looked at the data, the more it became clear that there was an association. Now, I've never seen any of my empirical work subject to this kind of scrutiny? Well, the association is spurious. Well, the association is causal. You didn't have instrumental variables. We said right off the bat, it's not predictive. It's not that gay men are leading high-tech businesses. And then the thing that landed me on Colbert, with a young woman named Charlotta Melander, a Swedish young woman, we actually looked at the role of artists, concentrations, gay male and lesbian concentration on housing prices. And what we found is controlling for income, controlling for education. The effect of this gay and lesbian arts culture thing was ginormous. But well, what is going on? So places that are more open, places that value people, that are more meritocratic, they're going to attract more people with skill and ambition and entrepreneurial verve. It's almost like an instrument. The gay and lesbian factor is a proximate variable for a place that's very open-minded and self-expressive. A place that, if a creative person, we know one thing about them. They want to self-express. They want to, whether they're Andy Warhol or Bill Gates, John Lennon or Mick Jagger, they want to express themselves, what's deep within them. So places that allow you to do that, that activate that allow you to mobilize resources, they're also the places that are going to gain an upper edge in the entrepreneurial and innovative realm. So that's what we found. And I'll tell you, the kickback to that. I've never been exposed to this kind of ricochet effect where people want to rip this effect to shreds. And I think it reflects the fact that's a hot button issue. But we think we've shed some light on it, and we think now newer generations of economists, this young man named Scott Page at Michigan has written a whole book on diversity. What he's concluded theoretically is if you want to get a new idea and innovation, you need cognitive diversity. Demographic diversity, a mixing of people, is a great proxy and a great way to get cognitive diversity.
Now, let's look at this from the perspective of businesses, because they're a big player in all of this. As they look at these realities, they look at the theory that cities are going to thrive more when they're more diverse and more open-minded, that they provide these amenities and so forth. What should they be taking into account as they try to position themselves to be magnets for creative talent?
Well, the first thing, for all you business folks listening in or viewing, I actually wrote a lot on this. I wrote the whole middle section of Rise of the Creative Class deals with how business can compete and can harness and mobilize creative talent. So take a look at it. I actually wrote a piece with Jim Goodnight in the Harvard Business Review looking at the SAS Institute. But I think for business, this ability to attract talent, and the companies that are doing this is best practice. The companies that are attracting people globally, that are putting in place diversity efforts, and I've gotten to speak to a number of these companies and see what they're up to. That's clearly the wave of the future. Now, don't get me wrong. I want to be really honest. Whether there's a city out there or a company that can harness one ethnic group or one racial group that can develop a niche in that, if they're religiously oriented, whatever it is, yeah, it's possible. So somebody will come up with an example of a city or a company that's more homogeneous, that's quite successful. But in general, the advantage you get from open-mindedness and diversity and meritocracy and being inclusive, and I think most importantly, what the real key to the creative age is, allowing people to self-express, allowing people to be themselves and not have to be this facsimile of a person, a company man, if you will, a company person. I think I said in Rise of the Creative Class, it's not like you can pump creativity out of someone or speed up the assembly line of creativity. People can easily withhold their creativity. So if you're not motivating them internally, if you're not motivating them intrinsically, if you're not allowing them to self-express, they'll just shut down and they'll use their creativity at night or on their off time. That's really the thing. So companies, it's not just, Peter Drucker said, you're no longer going to be able to motivate these creative people with money. You have to treat them as volunteers. You have to allow them to self-express. That's where companies have to get to. And I think the best companies, the biggest global companies, see that.
Now, we've got some questions from the audience, which have come in.
Awesome.
Which have come in through Twitter. So let me hit some of these while we've got some time left. This is from NEM Multimedia. He or she writes, how do we create a society that values the creativity of every person for the good of that society?
That's our end game, right? And that's my end game. And what the first thing you have to do, I think, is education and speaking and evangelism, and you have to get out there and make the case and show facts. The other thing I think we have to do is what this person did. One of the things that I find always happens to me is people see the word creative class and they say, oh my God, he's talking about a creative elite. Either an artistic elite or a technological elite, depending upon who. But in all my work, I've said every human being is creative. What we have to do is include everyone in this creative class. And I think so that's a continuous message, that it's not just about supporting a creative elite, an unequal society. It's about harnessing, enhancing this thing that every human being shares. Every human being shares, every child has, intrinsically, this ability to be creative. And then showing how we're not going to grow our economy, we're not going to be prosperous, we're not going to develop our people, allow them to have happy and fulfilled lives, unless they can. You know, I think the other part of this, look at the giant consumption and shopping binge that we just went through. What is that about? You know, I'm going to buy my identity on a designer rack. You know, and you look at these young gals, the young Hollywood gals, and literally a label on every part of their anatomy and body and the right car. That's because people can't find purpose, right? And I think what we really do is we don't create ourselves simply through consumption. I don't want to be anti-consumption. My dad was really happy when he bought a new Chevy. I'm telling you, and he waxed that thing, and there was pure joy in the guy's eyes when he got a new Chevy. But giving purpose in their lives and giving people purpose. I certainly felt a lot better in my own life when I found a purpose, you know, than when I was a young kid, you know, trying to play music or trying to get through school. I found a purpose. I could write. I could make a difference. And I think most people that you talk to, right, most people you might interview, when they find their purpose, it creates an enormous well-being. That's what psychologists of creativity and fulfillment tell us. Imagine if we could give that gift to more people, but not just to give them the gift. I think giving them that gift to self-express and be creative is actually the economic primes the pump. It creates more innovation. It creates more entrepreneurship. It gets people ignited and excited. And I think that's where we have to go.
Now, our next question is from Behance team. And I like this question because it keys off something you said earlier. They ask, how would you incorporate crowdsourcing to develop the creative class? And this actually reminds me of you talking about how companies are using their employees as a source of information. Can these tools, these information technology tools, particularly that allow crowdsourcing, play a part in developing both the creative class and also the service economy?
So back to first principles. Marx told us in his most brilliant insight when he was talking about how classes form in the working class, all labor is intersubjective. Now, a big fancy term for saying we all depend on one another. You can't make anything without, and he talked about science. And scientists, what do? It's dead labor and living labor. Any scientist will tell you we stand on the shoulder of giants. We stand on the shoulders of all those who came before us, and not only our team and all those who are around us. So whether it's factory production, whether it's services, whether it's agriculture, it's intersubjective, it's team-based. This whole idea that invention, finally we're getting over this, that there's a great genius. Around the great genius was always a fabulous, Thomas Edison, the first person to really build a team in a lab of technicians and chemists and machinists that support his ideas. Now we know that many people have these ideas. So the wisdom of the crowdsourcing is key. We have to tap, this is what Toyota told me. I went to visit Toyota when I was studying manufacturing about 1985. And I went to their factory complex in Toyota City in Japan. And the guy told me, Professor Florida, we're going to beat the big three. This is like 1985, 1986. Why? You think the key to success in your management in the West is the big shot CEO, Lee Iacocca, right? With all the great ideas, ramming it through the bureaucracy, turnaround man, flanked by 2 MBAs and a great research strategist. He said, we're going to win because we have tens of thousands of people on the factory floor and back through our supply chain, the crowd, that's going to harness this kind of energy. We're going to use their energy, their talent, these millions and millions of individuals. So the technology, I mean, is this incredible tool now that we have. And it's funny that the questions are coming in from Twitter. I mean, Twitter, I've always been fascinated by the internet. I taught at Carnegie Mellon. I was an early adopter. Nothing has fascinated me more than Twitter. For the ability to harness other people's information, but to get direct access to people I thought I could never talk to. And so I think the technology provides another enabling infrastructure. And I think the other thing, not only enables us to tap into the wisdom of the crowd, it also enables individuals to mobilize resources. So you have almost the crowd at your disposal as an individual, and as ideas become good, they can mobilize people, both consumers and workers. So I think the technology is part, it's almost like the railroad, right? The canal system was a technology of one era, the railroad was a technology and infrastructure of another area, the highway system, this thing, and it's not just the internet, this ability to use social media and mobilize intelligence. I've never seen anything like it. And just from a work point of view, my ability to collaborate and work with people, I don't even remember, and I'm sure most of us, I don't even remember how I could have worked before. The efficiency gains and the innovation gains are just so dramatic.
Next question is from Nien. He asks, what problems would be good for the creative class to solve in a company? I guess, is there a specific set of advantages or challenges that the creative class is uniquely able to confront within a company?
Well, you know, it's funny, getting across those borders, not just staying in your lab, but going to the factory floor. When I was thinking about the companies that have applied creative energy to products, to appliances, so those kinds of things, taking it into services. Agriculture, the development of new and better food products, the revolution of food chains, this whole Michael Pollan thing, that's where I think the real interesting problems are in society. And then ultimately, I think the local. So I think for companies to really realize how important their city or their community is, and one of the things I think that creative people are very attuned to is how important their local environment, like in Who's Your City, I wrote this. There are three big things that make us have a happy life. One is the work we do, the challenging, exciting work. Not money. Money's important, don't get me wrong, but it's the challenging work we do and the way we get purpose from that. Of course, it's our social relationships, our families, the love that's in our life and personal relationships. But the third piece that we always forget is the place we live is an important part of that. So I think for companies, thinking a lot more not only about the products they make, but the places where they're based. And actively, because the people, when I interviewed creative people, they said, I really love my work, but I'd actually like to spend more time not only at home, I'd like to spend more time making my place better. I'd like to volunteer and be involved in boards and all of this sort of thing. I think that's another area. And and also in development of technology and development of products. You know, IBM and lots of companies are getting into smart cities. Other companies are getting into green technology. I think a big opportunity, creative opportunity, are actually how do you remake locations and make them not only more creative, but more inclusive and sustainable. So that's a couple places at least to focus.
Now you actually hit on the next question pretty squarely, which was basically how do companies provide, what can they provide for the creative class that's going to attract them and make them want to activate their talents on its behalf? You mentioned a few there. Are there others?
Well, I think the mistake that cities or companies make, and I think sometimes in my name. So, oh my God, we put in, a new arts district. The arts district with the cool loft spaces is going to attract the creative class. The company says, oh my God, we decided, and we outfitted, we created open space and open layout. We got a great architect in here, and we have new modern furniture, and we have, pinball machines and Jolt Cola and an espresso bar, and that's going to do it. That's cool, that's cute. But I think the real thing that people want is the ability to be themselves and self-express. That's really the key thing. How does a company or a city figure out how to allow its people to be themselves, to self-express, to engage in projects that they find exciting, and channel that energy? So it seems to me that's the core driver. Everything else kind of has to be tuned to that. And for the members of the creative class, for those of us who have a lot of choice in what we do and where we do it, I think what we're really trying to find, I've been looking at this with a fabulous young psychologist named Jason Renfro. Jason is at Cambridge, and he was the first person, one thing Jason figured out is that you didn't have to do a personality assessment. You could just look at somebody's iPod playlist, and you could completely read their personality. What Jason and I have been looking at is the location of personality types. And there are 5 basic personality types, right? There's agreeable people, there's conscientious people, there's extroverts, there's emotionally stable or neurotic people. Then there's these people called open to experience. If you look at entrepreneurs, whether it's Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, if you look at great artists or musicians, chances are they're very, very high on this dimension called open to experience. Open to experience get their charge in life by consuming new experiences, by understanding new experiences. And what we're finding is that those people are highly mobile. And it's not like I say to myself, I'm open to experience, I want to find an open to experience neighborhood. These people find some way, by hook or by crook, they leave their hometown and they find the places, whether that's the San Francisco Bay Area or Silicon Valley or a part of Lower East Side or Soho in New York or wherever it is at the moment, because these places shift, right? They're exciting for a moment and then they go down. These open to experience people, what we find is they're highly clustered in cities, highly clustered near the core of cities, and highly clustered in particular cities. And so I think what they're searching for is not just a great place with a great scene and great espresso bars and great loft flats. What they're searching for is a place where they can be themselves, be surrounded by other experiential people and other things, and that becomes the stimulus to their endeavors.
Well, on that note, that very big and profound note, Richard, I want to thank you for joining us. And I want to thank the audience for joining us. Again, I am Peter Hopkins from BigThink.com, and this was a special live interview with best-selling author Richard Florida. Thank you.
Thank you, man.
Richard,
Time flies when you're having fun.
That was great, Richard.
Thank you,
really
man.
awesome. You know, and.